So let me just welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Vyes Remy. I am the Deputy Director of the Sridhar Rampal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, where we think and breathe trade, whether from the perspective of training, conducting policy research, or engaging in topical outreach activities such as this, our signature lunchtime chats. We bring to the fore in an academic and hopefully thought-provoking way issues of global import that affect the countries of the Caribbean. This is a very special and I would say opportune time to convene a high-level SRC lunchtime chat. As our friends will know, we do this on a monthly basis where we feature some aspect of trade policy, law, ongoing negotiations, and scrutinize these issues for a Caribbean audience. I say it is opportune because just yesterday, we heard about the first ever nomination of a female Secretary General of CARICOM, which the SRC greets with enthusiasm and high hopes. So CARICOM and its Single Market and Economy, the CSME, is uppermost in our minds. Also because of this report released a couple of months ago by the CARICOM Commission on the Economy entitled Caribbean 9.58, Speeding Up the Caribbean, a nod to Usain Bolt's heroic record-breaking 100 meters feat. The commission, under the chairmanship of Professor Avinash Persaud, comprises 10 members of eminent economists. Yes, only economists, which us lawyers are looking at enviously. It is a reconstituted body, the first one having been established at the direction of the Bureau of the Conference of Heads of Governments of CARICOM in 2013. In 2019, the special envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Professor Avinash Persaud, was appointed its chairman with a similar mandate as the previous one, to identify problems and find solutions to the economic developmental problems facing the region. The commission counts among its 10 members, Mrs. Therese Turner-Jones, who we are fortunate to have with us, the chairman, Professor Avinash Persaud, and 8 other economists of regional and international repute, including the current WTO Director General and a past Director General. One of the buzzwords that was used to herald in this new Caribbean Commission is that development in the region must be people-centered, meaning that it must be based around an idea of enhancing access of the individual to education, entrepreneurial and financing opportunities, access to the ownership of wealth, and access in basically every dimension. So since it has been constituted, how has this commission delivered? Well, one piece of evidence which we can scrutinize and which we will be scrutinizing today is the report that I mentioned earlier. It was released in February this year, and it is a 47-page report starting with a 10-point COVID declaration and call to action, followed by recommendations and a description of some of the issues in 4 main substantive areas, namely recommendations on goods and persons, their free movement, through a fast ferry network, focusing on that, mobility of labor and skills through critical changes to the skills nationals regime in the CSME, removing the obstacles to the financial sector by a regional approach to financial conduct, and raising the private sector's involvement in building resilience in the region to climate change. But the recommendations didn't stop at substantive ones. The CARICOM Commission wants to achieve these goals with minimal or zero government action being necessary. Finally, in a sense, putting to test this idea that it may be governments who are being thought to be standing on the neck of Caribbean integration, and letting it be people-centered and people-focused. There's another element which we'll talk about, which is it emphasizes that the process of integration can be achieved through a concept of subsidiarity, which is where the regional movement has to act. It will, otherwise the power resides in member states. And through an enhanced cooperation model, which is 5 member states who want to move forward, they are also hoping that Caribbean integration will be facilitated. CARICOM heads at their last meeting welcomed the report. They agreed that it should be published and circulated to facilitate a region-wide debate on the recommendations within the context of the economic challenges and prospects for the community. The report has been commented on already in numerous occasions, and I would say roundly endorsed by the Gleaner editorial board. It has also been the subject of discussion in local press, but interestingly, it has not been the subject yet of academic scrutiny, civil society, or importantly, it hasn't been publicly commented on by the heads themselves. So we at the SRC see this discussion as part of the CARICOM civic duty to educate and possibly scrutinize its contents. So after that wholesome and lengthy introduction, let me start by first welcoming 2 of the eminent commissioners of the report. Mrs. Therese Turner-Jones has been the IDB's country representative for Jamaica since 2013. And in 2017, her portfolio is expanded when she was promoted to general manager of the IDB's country department Caribbean group. She is a trained economist with over 25 years of experience in macroeconomics and economic development with a special emphasis on the Caribbean. Welcome, Mrs. Turner-Jones. Let me also welcome Emeritus Professor Avinash Persaud, who is a former senior executive in London, JP Morgan, and UPS. He currently serves as special advisor to the government of Barbados in a financial capacity. Among his numerous other roles, he has served as chairman of the regulatory subcommittee of the UN Commission on Financial Reform and chairman of the Warwick Commission on International Financial Reform, among other accolades. So here's how we're going to run the session over the next 80 or so minutes. We have with us 2 of the commissioners who will discuss 5 topics emerging from the report. We'll talk about the role of the commission and the commissioners and delve a little into the governance-related components of the report. So how are these recommendations going to or intended to take
Okay, Abby, I think. Yeah,
so Therese,
yeah.
I can hear you, but not Genevieve.
Yes, I think she's frozen. So I think maybe, and we expected that, anticipated it might happen, audience. So just bear with us. I think Avinash, you should just start and she'll come back in.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. And I thought Genevieve gave a very lovely, lucid, clear introduction. And so it's great to share a virtual screen with Therese. And so we had a great time together as commissioners, the wonderful set of commissioners. I think it might be unfair to suggest that they were all economists, implying that they come from a narrow background. I mean, we had Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, first female managing director of the World Bank, and then first, I think the most formidable job she had was female finance minister of Nigeria. And Pascal Lamy, we had Roger McLean, who is a health economics expert, Gregory Maguire, who comes from an industrial economics background, oil and gas and resources, Chester Humphrey, who has a Labour background, Senator Chester Humphrey, and then Therese, myself, Damien King, Wendell Samuels, who at the time was at the Technical Center for the IMF. So an economist, yes, but all very different perspectives, I think, to bear. One thing I would say about Janiv's introduction, though, I think the characterization of the report as saying that government should get off the neck of the economy isn't really what we were saying pretty clearly. I mean, I think what we were saying is that here are five recommendations that, let me go back one step. We know that there have been many good recommendations before. And one of the things that really gripped the commissioners, perhaps haunted the commissioners, was why another report? Why another set of recommendations? Will this report not just get shelved? Everyone will be very polite and they'll be very nice and we'll do a few webinars and then it'll just gather dust on the shelf until another set of 10 people who don't know how to say no get asked to write another report. And so we were very haunted by that. And we began thinking, why? So we spent a fair amount of time thinking, why had previous recommendations not been expedited? And I think we came up with two fundamental reasons. One of them is it's very hard to get unanimity. The characterization of CARICOM is, a squabbling set of people and no agreement. There's actually a lot of agreement. There are a host of things that haven't happened, that have been lying on the table for 10 years, not because nobody agrees. 12 people agree, 14 countries agree, 13 countries agree, but not all 15 agree. The burden of unanimity is a heavy burden. And I think it's very hard to get a unanimity. So one of the first things we were proposing, a bunch of people with an economics training said, this isn't about economics, this is about institutional governance. How would you get CARICOM moving again? It's stuck. And as long as you require 15 people to have an identical view about the future, then it's going to be very hard to move forward. So we consider that perhaps one of the most important issues, the most important recommendations. But the other reason that we feel that CARICOM has been stuck is that many of previous recommendations required huge resources, lots of money. And whenever you have a 15 people coming together to decide how money is to be spent, there are lots of arguments about, I'm contributing more than you're contributing. I'm just reading this book that Ingrid sent me on Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate. And one of the things he points out there is that old psychological thing we've all learned is that we all think that we're being hard done by somebody else. We all think we're better than average. And so you can imagine when there's spending involved, it was often a problem. And so one of the things that we decided to do was discipline ourselves because we were thinking, well, a lot of CARICOM's problems, a lot of our regional problems are not about money. It's about how we organize ourselves, how we, how we do things, not necessarily spending money. And so we disciplined ourselves by saying, we're going to come up with 5 recommendations that we think are going to move the needle for the regional growth that will not cost a cent. It is not that they will not require government intervention. It requires a lot of government organization in some parts, the way we handle the digital transformation of government that I hope Therese will talk about later. The way we deal with ports and free movement of data and goods and people, that requires a lot of government. But these are 5 recommendations that cost 0.0. It's not about money. So if we're going to have a fight, it's not about money. It's really about the political will to move forward. So that is, I think, that one of the first things I would say. But let me just say a few words as to background, talk a bit about what we mean by people-centric. And then I see Janive has returned. Maybe she could then talk us through some of the other questions she has. But you know, why did the chairman of the CSME in CARICOM, Prime Minister Mia Mottley, want to reconstitute the commission? And why are we looking at these issues? And I think in one word, in one sad word, it's decline. Because for the first 2 decades of our independence, we were an outperforming region. We were the region that Singapore came to learn from. We were the region that grew faster than other regions. And we did that because I think there was some catch up. We were starting from some low bases. We did that because of heavy public investment in education and health. We did that because we were an oasis of stability in a fairly frightening world. Now, democracy was a rare visitor into Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s and even into the mid-1980s. Those things propelled us forward. But somewhere between the mid-1980s to 1990s, we slipped back. We have been declining. We are now the slowest growing region in the world. We're now the most highly indebted region in the world. We're now the region with the most costly transport in the world. I know Therese and her team have done some work on that, and I hope she'll say a few words on that. So it's how do we arrest decline, especially in a world, and I'm coming to an end shortly. I feel I've been speaking a long time, especially in a world that's changed a lot, where technology has changed a lot, where the old notions that development was achieved through industrialization by invitation, that it wasn't an economy unless you were manufacturing something. These things have changed. The route to economic success is in services, is in, we believe, highly valued services, professional services, sold perhaps down broadband technology to China, Asia, anywhere else. The new technologies allow us to redefine who our neighborhoods are, who are the people we can sell to, who we can buy from. So that's why we call it people-centric. It's about development to us, and is about how do we allow any person in the Caribbean, every person, every girl, boy, man, woman, to be able to choose how they lead their life. That's development. Development is not working in a bigger factory. Development is that you've got choice about the way you live your life. Most people don't have a lot of choice in the way they live their life. Their choices are very constrained by lack of money, by lack of opportunity, by lack of schooling, by lack of jobs, lack of transport to get to the jobs. So development at the core is how do we make sure that all of our people have choice about the life they lead? And we believe that's about huge government in terms of public investment in health and education. We need to rethink what we mean by education. And that's something that Therese on the commission spent some time importantly talking about. We've been investing in the same thing. And one of the reasons why we're not performing very well is that if you spend the same amount of money on the same education you did in the 60s and 70s and 80s, you're getting diminishing returns. Education is a lot about learning by doing. Vocational education is very important for an economy, and the way we teach and the way we learn and what we're learning has all changed quite dramatically, and we haven't. We're really being laggards on that. So it's about public investment in education, in health, public investment in our markets to make sure they are there and they are demand. It's about helping to organize things like payments, things like the regional markets in procurement, in software. So there's a large role for the state to play in terms of mobility, in terms of investment, but it's not about giving you a job. It's not about defining what kind of job. It's about giving you, enabling you, giving you the power to choose what jobs, what life you want to lead. Let me end there and kick it back to Janive and Therese.
Thank you so much. This is the world we live in now. I got booted out, but thank you so much, Avi, for continuing the conversation. I wanted to just pick up, and I also want to give Therese the opportunity to speak But this idea of the slight shift in emphasis in terms of to whom these recommendations are really made, or with whom they are being made in mind. I was also struck by the idea of an enhanced cooperation approach, which is being touted and very much promoted in your report, which is that 5, and I don't know if there's anything magical to the number 5, but if a cohort of 5 member states wanted to go ahead on any of these recommendations, that they should be able to go ahead and do so, and in a sense, drive the process forward. Now, this is not new in regional integration systems. We have the EU with this idea of variable geometry. We even have the mechanism in the conference decision that we know about, where certain members have decided to go ahead with skilled categories of workers and promoting their free movement, whereas others have opted out. So it's not entirely foreign to CARICOM. But I just wonder, at what expense is that being promoted? To the economic regime, to the political sort of rigidity of the regime? How do you imagine, what are the pros and cons of that recommendation the commissioners have made?
As I said, I think we think this is one of our most important recommendations. And we were very ably supported by the CARICOM Secretariat. Evelyn, Joe Cox, and they were being very frank with us, and they would say to us, there are a good 15 or more agreements with CARICOM where there's a majority of people who want to move ahead, but because they don't have unanimity, it's stuck. A regional investment protocol, a regional financial services entity, all of these things have been stuck. So this will unstick. This is very real. This will unstick them because they're more than 5. 5 is roughly is a third. It's a similar ratio than the Europeans use for their enhanced cooperation mechanism with their 27 member states that they have. And we also began to road test a few ideas, like the fast ferry idea. So for fast ferry to operate in the Caribbean, well, we'll come to the fast ferry later maybe, but you need to have a number of countries having common agreements on how do you insure cars that are in another country? How do you allow people to come and with their bags, and that process to all happen within 30 minutes so the ferry can go off again. So you need, we reckon that 5 is a minimum. And I think a key point to your question is that 5 has to be not exclusive. It has to be very clear that this is inclusive. This is merely about timing of starting. This isn't saying that 5 are going to do their own thing. This is saying that 5 will start, that any other country can join at any time. They can't be stopped by the other 5 in joining. And indeed, for the 5 to start, the other 10 say, hopefully it won't just be 5, it might be 10 or 11, 12, but let's say only 5 wanted to go ahead. And the other 10, as long as there's no direct harm to them, then the 5 can start. And so we view this as inclusive, as speeding up the Caribbean, getting things unstuck. Now, it means we're not moving on everything together. I think this makes a lot of sense in the economic space. We have different economies, different economic structures, different places. We may decide to not do that on foreign policy. So there may be spheres of areas where we would keep that unanimity. But I think when it comes to the economy and CSME, the creation of the single market, we think this enhanced cooperation, 5 can move ahead if they want to, makes a lot of sense and will unstick the Caribbean.
Thank you, Avinash. I wonder, and I'm trying to read the room in a sense, the Q&A. I see a question from, is it Ms. Thelma Philip Brown, who says, this is an excellent report. In order for us to ensure that it doesn't languish in our shelves again, what are the first sort of few steps that you think, the first 5 or so steps that we need to actually execute on it? And I'll turn the floor to Therese to answer that as she moves into the next set of more substantive questions that I have, starting with the emphasis on digitization as a way forward. But I wonder, Therese, before I ask that specific question, if you had anything to say on what was said before by Avinash, but also thinking concretely of what do we do now, and ultimately how do we move from paper to implementation?
Thanks, Yaniv, and thanks for the 92 people that have Zoomed in or however they have connected to this session today, because I think this is a really important conversation. I want to comment first on why this report is different from other CARICOM reports. And Avinash said it in his opening remarks, which is that we were charged with doing something, and we thought the best way to do this would to be concrete, clear, straightforward in terms of what we were presenting. But I think the most important aspect was keeping that this would be a people-centered approach to thinking about the issues that plague the CSME and our region. So if we think along those lines, and if everybody listening to this conversation today think about what we are trying to do, which is really to improve the lives of every Caribbean citizen through integration, then I think when we look at it through that lens, the issue of subsidiarity, meaning 5 go first, the others come on later, or whether we start doing revamping education in some countries first to bring it more in line with what we need today. Digital transformation is already happening across a number of countries in the region. We've seen this in the pandemic, how important it's been, but it doesn't mean that everybody's at the same stage of development. So the important aspect of today's discussion and moving this report to implementation execution is really convincing everybody that lives in this region that it's worth doing and that it's achievable, and that the end result will mean that we don't have to be a region that has lagged behind for the last 3 decades in GDP per capita. So I saw a question in the Q&A, someone was asking, is it empirical that we have lagged behind? It is highly empirical. Our purchasing power parity vis-a-vis other countries of similar size has been on a declining trend for the last 30 years. And that's been documented in IDB reports and IMF reports and lots of reports, and you can check it. So I think, we keep talking about the urgency of having this move, and having experienced 2020, still living in a pandemic, looking at how devastating the pandemic has been on our region from an economic point of view. So we're calling it, a triple whammy, so to speak. There's a health crisis, there's an economic crisis, and there is also always looming in the Caribbean, the climate crisis. So when we look at all of these 3 things coming together, we can't be comfortable that we're not making progress on these issues. And I think the commissioners who came together were extremely fervent in this particular view. If not now, then let's just pack it in. The way the report is written is it extremely blunt on what's achievable, what's not. We're not trashing government policies. Avinash did a very good job of that in his opening statement. There is work for government to do, but I think this has to be driven by people. It has to be driven by citizens. We have to demand more of our governments to say that this is where we want to go as a region. Part of the report too is trying to connect it to the needs of everyday Caribbean people. So whether it's the ferry, or whether it's the skills certificate, or whether it's having access to the best possible broadband to connect us to the rest of the world, to take advantage of all that technology has to offer. Whether it's being able to sit in your home and do a business that you can transact over the internet to make money, not just in our region, but to the rest of the world. I mean, there are some very, I think, clear end game insight for us. And that's why it's written the way it is. That's why we're going about talking about it. That's why it's being published. Now, the commissioners can't do this work on our own, right? Avi and I can sit here and we can do endless number of these webinars to convince the population of this region that these are the 5 top things that we need to be doing. We also have to get the heads of government who signed off on this report to do likewise. So it's not another document to sit on a shelf, it's organic. And I think there's a lot of movement in this report. As you pointed out, Jenny, the Gleaner did a fantastic editorial saying why the time is now. And I think if we can spur every single person living in this region to be excited about what we've presented, we can get it done. And we can get it done because, as Avinash said, there's no immediate cost involved. There are ideas. These ideas are not new, but they may be packaged in a different way. We're picking up on where we are in terms of the economic juncture of where the region sits in the global community, what technology has to offer to make our economies modernized and more efficient, because we know that here we are sorely lacking. And also, how do we seize the imagination of young people, especially, to want to be part of this new Caribbean, Caribbean 9.58, right? How do we create more Usain Bolts, not just on the track field, but in business, in ideas and creativity and so on? How do we get governments to think about being 9.58 as well, right? Nobody wants to sit in line or stand in line to wait for a government service. Not anymore today. And I think what we're experiencing through this pandemic is we know that we can get things done digitally. We want to do this forever. We don't want to go back to standing in line. And so I think we're presented with an absolute gift of a crisis to take this forward.
Let me add a few words on next steps and process. And I should say that the Commission's mandate was to produce a report. It wasn't to make the change. That making the change, it will be done by our leaders, but led by our people, and our people pressing for this change. So our job is to present the report, to disseminate these ideas, to have listened. We had a number of sessions across the Caribbean. In Jamaica, were hosted by the IDB, in Barbados by the Barbados government. We had events in Trinidad. We had virtual meetings and speaking to experts. We have a large set of experts who were not members of the Commission, who we listened to and spoke to. So this is, in a way, the Commission's report is finished. Our job is to disseminate. Our political leaders are adept at getting people to do things for free. And so they then asked us to try and disseminate the report. But this isn't, but I think we're already seeing changes because of the nature of our recommendations. Because what we're asking for, unlike in Time for Action, another important report, elegantly written, but it almost bit off too much for unanimity for them to get unanimity. So I understand. I asked Evelyn before the call, Evelyn Wayne, who was the very helpful member from the Secretariat helping us, what's happening with the Enhanced Corporation. And we've got people coming up with a draft legislation on what that would look, a draft protocol on what that would look like for the CSME type issues. And so that will be perhaps not at the next CARICOM meeting, because drafting these things take time and require consultation. But I think this year, this will be presented at some point to the heads. I think once you have 5 member states being able to do something, you then open avenues that were never opened before. And I'll give an example of what we're proposing on the fast ferry. So we are one of the most expensive regions in the world to move things around. We often talk romantically about why aren't we food self-sufficient in the region? Well, if Dominica and St. Vincent are producing fantastic vegetables, and they do, but they have a weekly ferry, a weekly transport, very expensive and very occasional, you're not going to be able to sell fresh vegetables around the region. So we need a fast, daily, inexpensive service. This hasn't happened before because these things are expensive. These boats that can chart the blue waters of the Caribbean, these aren't easy waters. These boats cost $75 million US. But once you spend that kind of money, you're talking about big cargo potential. I actually think the fast ferry is not just about moving people. I think that most importantly, will be moving goods. You'd be able to call up a grocer in St. Vincent and say you want various dasheen and sweet potatoes delivered tomorrow. That would be possible. You could call up a Trinidad manufacturer of furniture and say you want your furniture set delivered tomorrow. That's now possible. That transforms trade in our region. But for that to happen, we need all the revenue streams for the ferry to make economic sense, because we're not talking about government buying the ferry. We're talking about the private sector running and owning a ferry. Now, they can only do that if they have all the revenue streams available to them. So we make it easy for people to load on goods and load off goods within the single market. We're going to make it easy for people to take their car to go off to Trinidad and drive around, or go to St. Lucia or Grenada. And that requires insurance companies to recognize that their car may not only be in this country, but some other country. But we need protocols to make sure that this is the way of getting around import of car duties. And you take your car in on the ferry, this is what all the customs officials will be worried about, and you leave the car in the country as you come back. So you need protocols. Getting 15 countries to agree to those would have been impossible. Getting 5 countries to agree, 5 close countries, which a fast ferry could move on, much easier. And we could talk later, if you like, Genevieve, about what we're talking about in terms of financial services and the Financial Service Authority and anti-money laundering being done centrally. That can be agreed on with 5 countries. Very hard to do with 15.
Well, I think it's sort of the conversation is evolving organically, and I like that. But I wanted to go back up to Therese and sort of probe a little bit the digitization piece, and linking it to some of the solid recommendations coming out of the report. And I'm cognizant that there are some questions in the Q&A tab, so I would encourage the commissioners to have a look at it as they are making their remarks. And remember, at the end, I'm going to open up the floor for anyone who wants to take it to ask direct questions to the commissioner. This is in the last 30 minutes. So you'll have plenty of time to articulate your questions. But I wonder about this digitization and this cross-cutting, undergirding infrastructure. There are lots of references in the report to how digitalization can actually facilitate integration. The idea of a more indigenous software industry, very important, given that we spend $100 million across the Caribbean outsourcing software and software services. The idea also of electronic verification of national credentials and lowering the requirement for skilled persons from the current category approach to CSEX, but enabling that through some kind of method of verifying these credentials, either on the blockchain or some other platform. Also, the idea of increasing and improving the roaming charges, the idea of the payment systems in being improved. So I know IDB is doing a lot of this work, Therese. I know your IDB lab also seeks to encourage young entrepreneurs in this new area. I wonder if any of these experiences can be brought to bear on some of these specific recommendations of the Commission as it relates to the infrastructure that is meant to power integration according to the recommendations of the report. So over to you.
So let's take the one around skill certification, right? So our report actually suggests lowering the skill certificate to limiting it to 2 CXCs, which as a Caribbean person, I'm a little offended that we have to go that low, but when you consider a country like Jamaica, 69% of the labor force, and not to pick on Jamaica because this is typical of other countries in the region too, but 69% of the labor force in Jamaica has 1 CXC or less. Okay, so that's a whole swathe of people who wouldn't be able to get a skills certificate. Okay, so so the notion that you need a skills certificate to go work in Barbados if you're Guyanese or Bahamian or Trinidadian is to, have a standard by which Caribbean people can move around in the labor market in the region. There is a lot of work that we're doing and that others are doing around having educational certificates on the blockchain. So the blockchain is a community of, I think most people know what the blockchain is now, but it's essentially, it's a solid way of certifying credentials that is almost inscrutable. So it's not as if Avi can fake my credentials because I have it on the blockchain. I also have the certificate, by the way, downloaded on my app. And CXC, the council, by the way, is on the brink, I don't know if they've already done it, but of issuing the certificates in a digital fashion so that people can move around with their certificates on their cell phones, which is one of the suggestions that comes out of the report, right? So when you arrive in Barbados, if you're Guyanese, you can say, here are my 2 CXCs or 3 CXCs or 10. And so I'm going to be looking for a job. I've got a job working X, but here are my certificates. And so you don't need a long, cumbersome, drawn out skills certification process to do that. That's one small example. But the big example for digitization across this region is really how to get government services to be more efficient, to be less paper-based, less need for people to actually present themselves to a tax office or a company registration office or any office to sign a piece of paper, because that's just not a very good use of anybody's time in a modern society. And we've done a report which shows that, for example, and back to Jamaica again, because of course this is the one I know the most because I work hard here to make sure that things improve. But in the case of Jamaica, you've got to present yourself about 4 times to a government office to get that same transaction done. So it's not as if when you go the first time, you're going to get it done. No, you're more likely to be shunted off to somewhere else to get another piece of paper, to come back to do something else. And so on and on it goes. But this is not, Jamaica is the worst case, but even our best case, and I think the best case was Bahamas, it still may take you 2 times to line up and get something done, right? So that's not good. That holds back our doing business in the country indicators back. Investors look at those indicators and say, oh my God, why would I want to work in a country like that? Or why would I want to invest my money in a country like that? So there are ways in which we need to approach government services that basically says, look, stop this nonsense and let's get things to be done more efficiently. Now, there's urgency around that today because we're in a pandemic. We don't want people lining up outside tax offices and so on. But still, we've seen lots of pictures where people are lined up outside tax offices across this region trying to get things done in a pandemic. If that is not your classic sort of problem to solve here, I don't know what is. Because not only is their health being threatened while they're trying to do that transaction, but we're actually going against our own advice, which is basically social distance. So there's the imperative. But more so in the private sector, and by the way, the private sector in the Caribbean isn't that much better than the public sector in terms of digitalization, because a lot of processes that we know, even if you try to do business with companies, it's pretty arcane. There is no digital signature, for example, in Jamaica that's legal. And Jamaica is not an outlier there. There are other countries that have not legalized a digital signature, which means that in a pandemic, we are still, my driver comes several times a week to me for me to sign a piece of paper, to go to some government office to get something done. That is just ridiculous in 2021. I lived for over 20 years in the United States. When we bought our house, every single aspect of the transaction was done online. I never met the buyer face-to-face. I never met the mortgage company face-to-face. Everything was done with transactions being done either over the internet or by FedExing documents. I didn't have to present myself anywhere. So think about all the myriad of transactions that take place in the Caribbean on a daily basis that could be done differently. And what we've seen, and I think I'm very, 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 very encouraged by 2020 and 2021 so far, is that we've seen the very rapid uptake of digital services, whether it's that companies, whether they're food services or whatever. But now all of this stuff has gone online. We're used to it. We can order stuff on our apps. It comes to our house. We pay the guy, or if we haven't paid them online, and we move along. I mean, our children have been forced out of the classroom, and most of them are at home languishing because either they don't have access to the internet or it's too expensive. So the whole idea of roaming charges being reduced and a common tariff across the region, I think is really important. But let's imagine, and by the way, the recovery out of this pandemic for the Caribbean, especially the tourism-based economies, we're looking at 2023. So we have another possible 2 years of living this kind of life, meaning working from home, studying at home. Someday you may be in the classroom to write the exam, but for the most part, our children are losing learning because the majority of them don't have access to their online classes because they don't have access to broadband. So when we talk about digitalization, we also have to talk about whether the infrastructure is already there. We know for the most part across this region, the infrastructure is sorely lacking. We know that there are, for the most part, 2 major ICT firms that operate in the region. And of course, they base their services on bang for the buck. So why would I go in the middle of Jamaica, in rural Jamaica, to put up a couple of towers if I know the client base is not sufficient to generate a return for me? So here we need some sort of public-private cooperation to make sure that broadband connectivity reaches everybody that needs it throughout this region, not just because we're in a pandemic, but because we need to be modernizing the way we work, modernizing the way we deliver government services, including health, by the way. There are some private doctors right now in this pandemic who are doing telemedicine, but the average person still has to present themselves to a public clinic or something because it doesn't exist in the public clinics.
If I could just add one thing
Yeah.
to what Therese is saying on digital, because Jenny, one of your earlier questions was from one of the audience, what are your practical steps? So one of them is that the enhanced cooperation measure is being drafted. Another one is that there's already a negotiating team negotiating with Digicel and Flow on creating a single data roaming charge for the region and trying to reduce these data charges so that we can have free movement, not just of people, of goods, but also of data. When Therese was talking, it reminded me of one of my early experiences of trying to get a police certificate of good character in Barbados, right? And naively, I went on the website and naively downloaded what was then a form. And it said on the website that the office opened at 9 a.m. So I turned up at 9 a.m. There seemed to be a very long queue of about 100 people. I didn't know what they were there for because I arrived in the morning. So I went right to the top and I said, here's my form. And they said, that's not the right form. I said, I downloaded it for online. They said, no, but we don't use that form. Here's the form. You're going to come in early and pick up the form. And I said, well, how early? I'm here, the office is opening. I said, oh, 5 a.m. People start queuing at 5 a.m. So to get a police certificate of good character in Barbados in the past, you need to go along at 5 a.m. Only when the office opened could you get at the form you had to fill out, and then you'd wait several hours. Basically, we worked out the other day that people were spending between 5 and 7 days, working days a year in dealing with government. Last week, I got a new police certificate of good character and a new digitized form, all online, and I got it back in 2 hours. Previously, it took 3 weeks and half a day to queue up, and I got it back in 2 hours, and it took me 15 minutes. That is the kind of revolution we're talking about. But I think I want to say something about the private sector, because the digitalization creates opportunities, but also risks. And we need to think about how we manage these risks. I think a good glimpse of the future today is in a website called Upwork.com. After this call, go and have a look at Upwork.com. On Upwork.com, firms all over the world post talents and skills they need for a particular project. And on Upwork.com, people from all over the world apply for those things. That is the future. It's a global labor market. How are our people going to be able to be on that platform, to have their skills to be internationally accredited on those platforms, and to be on that platform doing the higher value added things? Because what that's going to do is also lower wages for the lower value added things. The things that everyone can do, unfortunately, is going to be harder to earn a good, decent income from that, because that will be available, so easily available. So we need to give kind of extra training and certification to our people. The National Transformation Initiative in Barbados has just launched a deal with Coursera, where Barbadians now have access to 50,000 online courses for free. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. That should be Caribbean-wide. And some of those course producers should be Caribbean. We will create a market. So one of the things we need to do, and government needs to do, is to facilitate our people being able to go on these platforms, being able to have payment systems that allow them to get paid on those platforms, to have certification that's accredited on those platforms, and that also that they're operating in a regional market that gives them the learning by doing skills to compete well on these platforms. A good example of that is procurement. So one of the roles I play is deputy chair and head of the investment committee of the NIS for my sins. And we spent, the NIS has over the last 10 years, spent hundreds, millions of dollars, to be frank, on software. And you multiply that by the 15 other social security systems around the region, and over the past 10 years, we would have spent over $2 billion. Add that to the tax systems in the region, add that to all the other government systems, you got a market there for software of about $3 billion. And yet every time we want to do software, we look around and we can't find anyone here. And we go and we employ people abroad. So that's partly because there isn't a single market. So we need a single procurement market. And we need a system of prizes, for instance, on software. And if a company wins a prize on software, they get automatically entered into tenders. We're not going to distort our market so we end up with bad software, but we need to encourage local people. And how do we do that? By making sure there's a regional market, that's a big market, they have accreditation, and they have opportunities to be on tenders. So those are the kind of things we need to do in the new economy that's people-centric.
Thank you. I do want to open it up to questions. Therese, I will allow you to speak, but as you speak, one of the things that keeps coming up is how are we engaging the private sector tangibly, right? And there's a question about the multi-stakeholder approach. So there's a lot of great ideas, but I'm still with some of the audience members. What do we do next? What is the tangible next step? I think some of the recommendations on climate resilience go very far in proposing ways that we can get investment by the private sector. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think even the suggestion about a private sort of ferry system, and I saw a question from Tymoon Stewart saying, well, if we only start with 5 members, will we have the critical mass to ensure that this is actually going to be cost effective and competitive for them? So
we don't have to just start with 5. We don't have to just start with 5. We do have to start,
so, but the business case has to also be effective. For
no, but what I'm saying, Jamie, but let me finish this point.
And then I'll let you have your rejoinder. I'll let Therese go, and then I'll let you have your rejoinder, and then we'll go really quickly to climate change so I can really open up the floor. Therese?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question about the private sector, because just to go back to some work we've done at the IDB on the private sector in the Caribbean, you know, only about 1/3 of all the firms in our region have R&D, research and development, arms to their organizations. So that means that our private sector is pretty much stuck, also like government, in arcane ways of doing business, right? And I'm talking about manufacturing firms, I'm talking about all sorts of a whole cross-section of private firms that we interviewed. The first study we did on this was in 2014, and we're doing a refresh now. But I think what is consistent across these studies is the lack of innovation that we see in some of our private firms. And not to name any names, but just to say that I think it's a general issue, which suggests that there is something about how we do business in this region. And it could be because our markets are small and the firms that dominate tend to, they can make money without having to do the innovation because competition is not that great for some of these firms. So when we talk about how do we engage them now to be excited about some of these issues that we're raising, it's, the private sector needs to say, okay, how are we contributing to this modern Caribbean that we want to see? Is my firm doing the best it can do in producing whatever it's producing or in engaging the type of labor that we need? Am I doing any training for the workers that work in my company? I once went to a chamber meeting and I asked this group of companies, how many of you are using any kind of robotics on your factory floor? Well, that was a bit of a, what? Why would I do that, Therese, when I can have 10 men to do the same thing? I don't need machines to stock my shelves because my 10 men are cheaper than the machine itself. So that also goes to a mindset about how we view technology use in augmenting the labor that we do have. And we need to focus on trying to get those productivity improvements. And the productivity improvements are only going to come from two ways. You either have smarter labor, or you're going to be using technology to make your labor smarter, right? And I think that's what we want to see. We want the private sector to say to governments and say to organizations like the IDB, the World Bank, and others who are working in these areas to say, look, we want to see more investment in this, this, and this, whether in the case of trying to make our operations more digital, we need better broadband, right? So that could be one. We need infrastructure. If we don't have the fiber optic cables running throughout all the towns across Jamaica or in the islands of the Bahamas, you can't get that. You can't offer telemedicine if the broadband is weak and if people can't connect to the doctors. So I think we need to have good conversations with the private sector to say where are the areas we can get the best value out of some of these ideas that we're putting forward, and how can they help us do that? The government can't do it all. The private sector is better to solve some of these problems than governments. We know that. Abby just talked about software developers, for example. The reason why we don't have many in our region is because our educational system is not pushing out enough people with STEM education, right? We're not doing that great on mathematics and engineering and so on. We're doing a good job now of exposing a lot of young children to coding. I mean, every year there's a, ICT Girls Day, and a lot of children in some schools, but not in all schools, are learning how to code. I mean, that should be, a 3D printer, for example, should be in every school across, a primary school across this region. Not so much the children that they're going to be producing, body parts in primary school, but children need to be exposed to the fact that 3D printing is now the way that some of these things will be done in the future, right? Including housing. We have a housing deficit. Houses can be produced with 3D printers, but we don't have the technology, we don't have the firms who are willing to explore those solutions. And so we get stuck doing things the same old way. And so what I want to hear from the private sector is, what is it that you need? How can governments help you get some of these modern ways of, whether it's producing whatever it is that you produce, how can we get better markets for you by, improving the way you do business and how you produce and how you manufacture? So I think there's a lot that the private sector could be doing. I don't want to say that our private sector is completely coddled, but we know that in some countries, the private sector has, pretty tight connections with government. And so in some instances, the incentives aren't there to do what they need to be doing. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future.
I think you'll see some disparity across the private sector in the Caribbean. We have one attendee saying that this, the tourism sector is ready to talk and discuss the contents of this report, and they're characteristically very well organized. I wonder, for the less and more dispersed sort of private sector constituencies, if that might be the problem, identifying that cohort that with which or with whom you can have that conversation. But tourism has indicated a willingness, commissioners, to have a discussion. So let me just flag that. Avinash, I cut you off. Yes.
Yes,
I cut you off on the point about 5 not being a critical enough mass to facilitate a competitive ferry system.
Yeah, and I think that the broader point I think I would like to make, and it partly links to something you just said, is that one of the things we're dealing with is despair. And people have written off CARICOM. CARICOM has appeared stuck for too long. They don't believe anything good will come from CARICOM. That's a very strong position, perhaps more held in Jamaica, but it's, I think, quite common across the region, especially amongst the business community. Now, and that's why we need to talk about this, because when you've written something off, you don't see things that are changing. And that's why we do need to engage. So the idea that we are drafting an enhanced cooperation protocol where 5 countries can move ahead, that's real and radical. The idea that we are negotiating for the first time ever as a region with Digicel and Flow as a region on a single data carrying rate, and maybe it's like an outside Caribbean and inside Caribbean rate, is radical and real. We are also, the fact that there is in one country, and there will be in others, 50,000 online courses available now for anyone to sign up to a Python coding course for free. That is radical and real, and we can do that across the Caribbean. And the fourth thing we're doing, you talked about the private sector and renewables and climate change. So the bill for making our countries resilient is a bill that is far in excess of $20 billion. It's far in excess, whatever that number is, from what the governments can actually afford. So we need to engage the private sector. The private sector will be prepared to invest in things that have a revenue stream, but they need to, the private sector will tell you they don't mind investing in things, they want to invest, but give me the good things to invest. Give me the things that will help resilience. And so what that needs is some classification. So we've engaged, so Barbados and Dominica are going through a pilot scheme with the IFC, where they are going to come up with a list of private sector projects that generate revenues and rate them in terms of their sustainability. So we can then create the growth and resilience bond we're talking about, which will be investing in anything above a particular rating that an independent body has determined, a sustainability rating. So here you have a mechanism to help the private sector in investing in resilience and sharing that resilience burden. But on the five, I mean, basically that's the minimum. So if your business case says you need 6, then you don't wait for 5, you wait for 6.
Well, excellent. I think, I don't know, Therese, before I actually allow people to raise their hands if they want to take the floor, otherwise I'll just go through the cascade of questions in the Q&A, but anything on this mammoth problem of climate change that our governments are dealing with, and different ways of incentivizing the private sector, not necessarily to purchase bonds, but also to think about ensuring their homes in climate resilient ways, and the role insurance companies can play in that way. Again, thinking about a people-centered approach to CARICOM that takes a little bit of the burden off of government and incentivizes the private sector to find ways of creating products in which the people in our countries can actually participate. Any ideas coming out of the report that you wanted to share?
I mean, what I fear about climate change is sort of the way we treat the hurricane season, right? I think every Caribbean person knows that the hurricane's coming, hurricane season's coming, so we do the modicum of preparations. But we always, when we get the weather reports, it's not going to hit Bahamas, or no, it's not going to hit Barbados, or it's not coming. So there's something about human behavior where we do things at the last minute, right? So, and until we're forced to do it, we basically don't act. And my fear on the climate change agenda is that we are saturated with climate change issues. We've seen all these international summits. We've seen statements that governments have made, agreements that have been signed, national commitments have been made to do this and that. But it, again, it's not boiling down to individual household level or even school children level that says, okay, if this is a reality for the Caribbean, what is it that we should be preparing our citizens to do? And when do we start that preparation, right? So you mentioned insurance. So obviously there are a number of financial instruments that are available from the IDB, the World Bank, and others on insurance for governments. You know, it's hard to get a mortgage on a house if you don't take out insurance. But I agree with you, we need more day-to-day messages that penetrate our psyche, that it's here and it's not going away, right? So I think the obvious big issues like a hurricane's coming and natural disasters coming, do we have insurance? Have we prepared ourselves? Do we have a disaster risk mechanism in place in the event that something bad happens? What are we going to do? But climate change is because it's long and it's drawn out and you're not really sensing it every day of the week, you can sort of forget about it until, oh, we don't have any more mangroves for our coastal protection. And we've seen some very high profile cases just this week across this region where mangroves have been destroyed because investments, whether it's in the tourism sector or in the oil and gas sector in the two countries that I'm referencing, you know, those permits have already been issued, the mangroves have been destroyed. Governments, on the other hand, have said that, yes, we have to look after our mangroves, but in these two cases, well, somehow we didn't manage to do that. So I think there are a lot of issues here on the climate change agenda. We need to start educating earlier. We need to really hold whether it's our environmental agencies accountable for the protections that they're supposed to be giving to the country to manage climate change better. And we need to monitor what's happening. So why contracts would be given and breaches would be made in these particular areas is still baffling to, I think, all the citizens in those countries where these two cases I'm talking about. But I think we really need to be more determined about it, more intentional, start the education early, do behavioral nudges to get people to think about these issues on a daily basis. You know, so that we start changing our behavior, whether it's, you know, our use of plastic bottles, what we do with our waste. We don't have enough messages reminding people every day that climate change means less rainfall, so we need to be looking after water conservation. It means, you know, fewer yields to those crops because there's no water. There's a lot of adjustment that needs to take place, and the planning for that adjustment and the mitigation against climate change has to be, you know, it's almost too late for us to start, but we need to be doggedly adhering to a plan. And I'm not seeing that across this region. Having said all of that, yeah, somebody's asking a question.
So sorry, Therese, you finished.
I was also going to really quickly ask Eisenhower Douglas to ask his question because his hand is raised. But
okay.
I would like to say an important point, because I mean, we have made a very strong perspective that private sector insurance is not the frontline defense against climate change. So I want to explain that a little bit. And we say that, I mean, you know, we need all the tools they are, and it would have been better if the region was more insured than it is. But starting off from an uninsured region, it's going to be very hard to get the private sector to insure against a risk that is rising dramatically in cost and is increasingly correlated. Insurance works when you can pool and spread risks, when they're diversified and low, as opposed to something that's big, high, and rising and correlated. An example would be if the UK tries to insure itself against climate change, that's possible. It has a 0.5% GDP loss potential for the next few years. if Dominica tries to insure itself against climate change, it's a potential 226% of GDP loss, which is what they lost in Maria. There's no affordable insurance premium for that. So we say that we need two types of frameworks. We need a framework where the governments can get access to easy liquidity at a time of a crisis, to help with relief. And the IDB is one of those people who are helping tremendously with that. It's a contingent credit facility that you don't need to go and apply for it. The middle of the hurricane hits, you've got access to 2% of your GDP, which is what you need to buy food and water and drop it into the country. So we need liquidity. The Barbados natural disaster clauses, Barbados is the world's largest issuer of bonds with natural disaster clauses, instantly frees up 7% of GDP. That's the kind of thing you need for liquidity. But if you've lost 226%, 7% is useful, but not very helpful. So ultimately, we need to bring down the 226%. We need to bring it down to something manageable. And that's about investing heavily in resilience. Now, building codes can do that, better building codes, but that's not enough. We actually need to spend money. Resilience is expensive. And that's why we need to have these bonds that will invest in things which are sustainable. And by classifying something as sustainable, rating it and ranking it independently, we can attract new types of money. We can attract development money, social impact money, and that allows us to fund resilience cheaper than trying to fund it entirely privately.
Thank you. That was the most succinct and best explanation of, because I'm not an economist, so of understanding how exactly the insurance and the risk management can be done in an effective way that takes some of the burden off of government, but nonetheless allows the private sector to be part of the resilience, so the resilience piece. I think what about civil society in the Caribbean?
Okay, can I come in now? Can I come in, Douglas? Can I come in now?
Please go on.
Yeah. Can I ask my question?
Please go ahead.
I think so. Is that Douglas or Eisenhower?
Yeah, Douglas. Yes, Eisenhower Douglas from Dominica. First of all, I want to say how pleased I am to be part of this discussion. You know, very, very interesting, very relevant, and I'm very pleased that you all have undertaken this study. I want to say also that the number of good points you made. First of all, you spoke about the private sector. I understand recently there's the CARICOM private sector organization. I don't know whether there's any linkage to the work you're doing with that entity, because in terms of the role of the private sector, which is supposed to be emerging to get the CSME to be more effective, I suspect the CPS will have a linkage. So if you can say something on that, that'll be one. Secondly, I want to say also that the point you made about the 226%, the impact of Hurricane Maria on the Dominican economy, absolutely correct. And you know, and so and the whole insurance dimension and things of that nature, you know. But we have a bit of we have a very dynamic PM, and of course he has a very good link with Mia Motlin in Barbados. So I would like to believe that Dominica will find itself among those 5 countries which you spoke about, and that would help us tremendously, because I had a lot of, I remember the Sridhar Ramphal report, Time for Action. I have it. I have all the documents and so on. Sridhar Ramphal, former Secretary General of the Commonwealth. Very interesting work. And we have to find a way to ensure that what happened to that report doesn't happen to this report. I mean, it was very good in terms of the academic community, a lot of ideas, and some of it was followed up here and there, you know. But we need to operationalize it so that we can be the Singapore of, you know, of the world in terms of output, performance, quality of life, living standards, and so on. You know, I think that's what the purpose of this exercise is all about. The tire have to hit the road. So I just want to share my optimism with you all. Thanks very much.
So Eisenhower, one of the additional personal things that haunt me about producing another report to lie on shelves is that my father was Sridhar's economic advisor, worked with him very closely through the Commonwealth years when he was chief economist at the Commonwealth Secretariat and worked on the Time for Action report. So I'm very conscious that here's a report. We reread it before we wrote our report and before we began, and it's a very well written report. It's a great report, and that's why we were haunted by the question of what do we need to do to make sure that our report does not become like Time for Action, which is well politely received, but nothing does. And that's why we discipline ourselves. Nothing that costs money, action, but no money, and that the institutional change. The CARICOM private sector body was established when Mia Motley was chairing CARICOM. It then became a body that actually attended CARICOM heads meetings. So they attend and they write a report. So they're now much more plugged in. They've been looking at ways in which we can reduce our import bill through better coordination. I think part of the reasons why we import so much is not just because we have a taste for things overseas, but there isn't proper coordination of the demand. Farmers don't know what the demand is, even though we have that information. So one of the things they're doing is trying to provide better coordination of that. And we certainly have presented our report to them in the heads environment and have got feedback from them. And so it reflects that as well.
I wanted to go to Elizabeth Morgan. A question, Elizabeth?
Elizabeth.
We can't hear you.
You're on mute, Elizabeth.
You're still on mute, Elizabeth. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, actually, I did not intend. I wrote the question in the chat. I did not intend to come online.
So this is a bonus. We get to hear you.
But
Tell us your question.
Since I have been forced to come online, painful? I guess I had the choice not to. I will raise the three questions the three points that I made. One was on the question of unanimity. I was not aware that all decisions in CARICOM were based on unanimity. Voting is allowed in CARICOM, not used, but allowed. Consensus is what decisions are taken by. And as a result, as far as I'm concerned, if a decision is taken in CARICOM by consensus, the member states can proceed to implement. The problem has been that when the member states get to capitals, they refuse to implement. And this is the problem of CARICOM. The complete lack of will and the 5-year cycle by which those in charge in CARICOM think it's to the next election cycle. So if a particular issue that comes up in CARICOM does not fit into the election cycle, then it is not taken. It's not a question of unanimity, which I don't think most decisions. I couldn't find my copy of the revised treaty of Chagarama fast enough to look it up. But I'm not convinced that all decisions are by unanimity, which means everybody has to agree, which is different from consensus. The second
let me hear all your points. But I would say practically, Elizabeth, whether it is they could or not, practically they have relied on unanimity for CSME issues. Maybe they don't need to, but they have done so. And this gives them the permission and the power not to do so. I think your enforcement point is a great point, but that's why we have the CCJ. And the CCJ has actually been an effective tool. It could be more effective, but take Barbados. We've been taken to the CCJ twice, we've lost twice, and we've paid up on 2 occasions. And I think if we were not to pay up, I think the repercussions of a country not conforming to their international treaty obligations would be quite serious. So yes, we should tighten up enforcement, but that's why we have the CCJ, and it's a tool that we is not absent, and we can make it stronger. But I interrupted you. You had another question.
Yes, because
I think Elizabeth? Okay, whilst we wait, I think there's so many more questions.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Okay,
we should.
Elizabeth, we have some more questions, so I'm just going to ask you to make the intervention as short as you can, please.
Okay, the issue of dispute settlement and sanctions is an important one. The other question I had raised in the chat was on civil society. What is the role of civil society? And that this is part of the problem, that civil society is not a strong advocate and should be working in tandem with the private sector. And I will remind the host that she voluntarily gave me the floor. I did not request it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Janine, I can take a stab at the civil society one because I think it's a really important point, and it speaks to a broader issue globally. I think that there is what I'm characterizing as a lack of trust in government. So if we go on what happened in the United States in the last 4 or 5 years, if we look at social media commentary on how our governments are performing, you sense that there is brewing in our region. Avi described it as despair, but there's also a cynicism that can be extremely detrimental to the future of our region. And I see that all the time. So I think Elizabeth's onto something by suggesting that civil society has a role to play, because if we're talking about a people-centric solutions, then obviously we ought to be engaging with civil society to get some of these ideas not just socialized, but also adopted and almost like mainstream. But I think that some of the issues in the Caribbean around civil society is that governments have a very strange way of dealing with civil society, almost seeing civil society as a proxy for opposition. So we need to figure out a way to get the views of our societies in a way that is not politicized. You know, it's not always black or white. You know, there's room to argue along a spectrum, and we need more dialogue, more conversations, more engagement of people. And I go back to young people again. We need to bring the voices of young people to the table, because the future is really theirs. And if they're not buying into this notion of a region that's called CARICOM and that is integrated, then I think we are really shooting in the dark. So hopefully we can do more with civil society as well, civil society groups.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm aware we have 2 minutes to the close of the event. There are lots of questions that I could not and did not get to. But in your one remaining wrap up, guests, commissioners, I wonder whether you can leave us with some parting thoughts on, you know, what is really next for this report, and what would you like to see in order for it to take on a life of its own. I take the point that it was a report and you were commissioned to create the report, but we don't want reports that stay on the shelves. So I wonder if I can just probe you a little to tell us the next tangible step any of us can take in making sure the recommendations see the light of day, or that we have a rabid discussion about which ones can stay and which ones can't. Of course, you will recommend all, but I wonder whether you can say to us which are the ones that need action immediately, and what that action actually is as we wrap up in the next 30 seconds each. I'm sorry to put the gun on your heads, but we'll have to wrap up soon. Maybe I'll start with Therese.
Yeah, my quick 30 seconds. So I think more conversations, more discussions in smaller groups, civil society, private sector, academia, pick up pieces, challenge the commissioners to explain what we meant. And then we need to just, you know, keep socializing the issues and pressuring our governments to move. But obviously there are some areas that we don't need government to really move, right? The whole issue of digitalization and digital transformation, yes, we need infrastructure, but I think there are things we can start to do already to make sure that that happens. And because I think technology really is the way forward. There's no country on earth that is moving now without using technology effectively. And I think more acceptance of that will help us go a long way in achieving some of these goals. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that in our small democracies, if we want governments to act, it's because they believe that there is pressure to act, that the people want movement. And so we decided as a commission early that one of the things we would take on upon ourselves, and we sought the heads of government agreement, is to disseminate the report, to start a debate, a discussion. And thank you, Jenny, for being part of that. So that's the first step. I think the key gateway is the enhanced cooperation. And I think once we can get that, it's being drafted, hopefully it'll be presented, not at the June meeting, but at the following meeting, which will be what, September, October, heads of government meeting. Once we get that, then I think that we will then need to identify sponsors for each of the different issues. They will build a coalition of at least 5, hopefully more, maybe 15, but at least 5 who could move ahead on the fast ferry, move ahead on the freer movement of labor, move ahead on a more regional financial conduct authority, and move ahead on the growth and resilience bonds.
Thank you so much. Let me just end actually with the words of Jermaine Beckford, who kind of, I think, really captured the essence of where we are. He says, CARICOM has, in my view, never truly taken time out to engage with the people of CARICOM. The whole approach seems to be top down, and it truly does not filter down to those in society upon whom they seek to effect change. And in that spirit of a people-centered approach to Caribbean integration, I want to close and really throw it out there. The gauntlet is on all of us, whether it is through more engagement at the subsectoral level, tourism, all the other sectors, digital economy, or at an academic institution like ours, to take these recommendations, debate them, prod them, and ultimately from the bottom up, make some of them actually work. So I want to thank the commissioners for the thinking behind the report, for taking the time to engage us in this forum, and encourage you in your work, and really throw it out to those of us who are here, civil society, the academic community, the private sector, to take them and run. I want to thank the audience who has been very patient. I think we've retained, the attrition rate has been very low. We've retained most of the people who started. I apologize for the technology. I have been trying to navigate the platform with my finger on my WhatsApp, on my handheld mobile phone due to technology problems, but I think we got there in the end. So on behalf of the SRC and everyone else at the University of the West Indies, let me thank everyone for being part of the discussion and wish the commissioners all the best in ensuring these recommendations get implemented. So thank you, everyone, and see you at another lunchtime chat.